made it to page 4. I'm going to try to read this more, speed it up. Page 4, pretty much got to get to 14. Page 14, and then there's a footnotes that's about 9 pages long. I'm going to try to make this as fast as possible. At times, the disapproval of Garvey among American-born black leaders could turn into a general characterization of black people not born in the United States and as alien troublemakers. Let's see. Try to read this like this. Even as early as 1920, prominent figures, including Randolph, Du Bois, and Owen, saw UNIA as an organization primarily of and for people of West Indian or Caribbean descent. The UNIA's success amongst African American nationwide, however, is proof that the UNIA also successfully appealed and represented their interests. The perpetuation of the idea that UNIA was primarily for and composed of people of Caribbean island origin is important, however. The credence that this concept was given by a number of African American leaders indicates that they thought the UNIA's support base as being very different from their own, and points to possibility that African American leaders exploited perceived ethnic differences or tribal differences for their own ends, and in order to bolster their own claims to be legit and to be legitimate leadership, basically. The existing secondary literature on UNIA reflects deep-seated personal animosity between Garvey and the likes of Chandler Owen, Cyril Biggs, W.B. Du Bois, Robert Abbott, but much less how it's been written about how tensions played out between grassroots UNIA supporters or between UNIA supporters and supporters of other black organizations. Much of what has been written is critical of the UNIA in a way that does not allow for a balanced investigation of the forces that drove political rivalries at the grassroots level. Now, I do want to note that the term political usually talking about Democrats versus Republicans or political parties, but you wouldn't people running elections to run the country or the mainstream government. So, but I guess political is being used here as as a way to tell what kind of policies the people should follow, what kind of laws, order, culture people should follow. As a policy, political, it means rules, laws. So it's talking about rivalries on the destiny of black people, basically. It's a rival and the laws that they should follow, the ideas that they should follow, how they should move. So it's not a common way to use political, but basically that's what it's talking about. Some people would use political, the word cultural, or trying to change the culture, but they're using the word political. Let's see. I'll say the lack of a wide historiography on the issue of black political violence in this period and of the UNIA's involvement might be explained in part by what some historians have identified as scholarly reluctance to give wide credence to UNIA's racial nationalist platform and to engage with less respectable facets of interwar activism in general. So I guess it's saying that the historians don't like to give the UNIA respect, basically. At all. Also, the purpose of the study is not to offer defense or an excuse for confrontations and violence and violence that the UNIA was involved in, but rather to set such confrontations in their proper context and to ask why UNIA supporters at times found themselves involved in such clashes While the study refers to the already well-covered rivalries between the various leaders, it does so with the aim of understanding how those leadership rivalries influence the actions of supporters at the grassroots or local level. That is how the symbolic violence of the war of words may have both led to and limited physical violence. Most of the confrontations covered in this study occurred in New York City, but others took places in Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Chicago, New Orleans, and Miami. In terms of ethnicity, the two main black groups that encountered each other in the U.S. in the early 20th century were African Americans and black people of Caribbean background. Although limited evidence base means it is difficult to make firm assertions about the exact ethnicities of those involved in the confrontations covered in this study, contextual information nonetheless allows us to infer that political tensions may at times have been linked to ethnic distinctions, specifically when those distinctions have become tied to loyalties to different organizations or factions. In particular, interwar black nationalism in New York City gained a reputation for being aligned with Caribbean ethnicity. The situation can be compared with that in the South, where, with the notable exception of Florida, the UNIA's grassroots black nationalism drew its support largely from the Southern African American population. Yeah, that's notable because even today I'm organizing in Florida, and Florida, like New York City, has a strong Caribbean. Well, Florida is, it's surrounded by Caribbean islands and it's dipped in the Caribbean Sea. We have the Gullah Geechee Sea Islander Coalition. That's the Caribbean Sea. Some people call, the southern. It's basically the Caribbean Sea, North Caribbean Sea in the south. They call it the Gulf of Mexico. But we have Caribbean culture, or it's the Caribbean Sea, basically. The Belize, Central America, the South, Jamaica, they're all in the same axis. Mexico is the Caribbean Sea. Just, in reality. But anyways, that much of the negative attention from African American leaders focused on Garvey's Caribbean background and Caribbean background of some of his supporters, particularly in Harlem, indicates that his African American critics saw his national background and ethnicity as an effective way of discrediting him. Some of Garvey's African American detractors may have even seen their resistance to Garvey and the UNIA as proof of their own loyalty to the USA. Such a trend was catalyzed by a general move towards nativist, xenophobic propaganda throughout American society during the war period. Because of the nativist nature of the criticisms leveled at Garvey by his African American critics, the presidents of Garvey helped to focus ethnic awareness in ways not so apparent before his organization galvanized such spectacular appeal in Harlem. Because black leaders were generally active in cities, confrontations between their supporters seem to have happened most often in these urban areas. So, linked to this is the consideration that intraracial tensions were more pronounced in urban areas that had experienced significant levels of black immigration during the early 20th century. The reduction in the availability of European labor during the war years was one of the catalysts for the great migration of black people towards cities. Around 400,000 African Americans left the rural South between 1910 and 1920, bound mostly for industrial centers. Meanwhile, thousands of immigrants from the Caribbean arrived in Harlem between the start of World War I and passage of immigration legislation in 1924 that restricted such immigration on the ground of quotas. In total, between 1900 and 1930, around 40,000 black from the Anglophone or English-speaking Caribbean islands settled in Harlem, a movement that largely coincided with the internal migration of black Americans from the rural South to towns and cities, many of which were in the North. During the years of peak migration, original inner-city residential areas previously occupied by blacks and other ethnic groups in centers such as New York City and Chicago could no longer keep up with demand for housing from newly arrived migrants from the South and the Caribbean. Given such a housing shortage, it was the inner suburbs, areas such as Harlem and New York City and the South Side of Chicago, rather than central inner cities that could provide a large supply of available housing to be rented at relatively low rates. Overall, the multinational migration to areas like Harlem and Southside Chicago led to an increased focus on black ethnicity rather than just on race, as various black identities were first transported to and then contested within new demographically concentrated urban American settings. Immigrants to New York City from the Caribbean were generally more financially stable and better educated than African American migrants who arrived from the South. The cost of travel and financial requirements for entry to the U.S. meant that a high proportion of arrivals to Harlem from the Caribbean were middle-class artisans and small business owners. Positive views of Caribbean New Yorkers among both white and black onlookers often indicated an acceptance that American-born blacks were culturally inferior, and awareness of such perceptions could in turn have the effect of fueling tensions and even clashes between American-born blacks and those of Caribbean descent. In the post-World War context, African Americans who had fought for the U.S. or who were linked to those who had fought often resented the better social positions and treatments afforded to recently arrived black people from the Caribbean islands. Hence, while at times the experiences of the war era could serve to unite people of African descent, at other times those experiences could highlight and exacerbate differences amongst them. Adding to such differences of experience and outlook was the fact that the Caribbean immigrants tended to have a different vision of activism from African Americans. While Caribbean-born black activists were frequently frontal in their attacks on racial injustice in the U.S., African Americans were often more cautious and incremental in their approach. This can be explained by the fact that African Caribbean people were unused to being the racial minority. They tended to have a lower sense of race consciousness, yet a higher sense of class consciousness than African Americans. The color class system of the Caribbean islands often meant opportunity for some social and economic mobility for lighter-skinned black people within island society, while U.S.-style racial segregation was far more rigid, even for skilled, educated, lighter-skilled African Caribbeans or Caribbean Africans. With the end of World War I, returning black war veterans were the latest physical embodiment of a bold spirit of assertive black masculinity in the USA. Although Victorian concepts of restrained class-based manhood still influenced those men who had dominated turn-of-the-century black society and politics, such Victorian-era ideals were becoming less applicable to the men who had experienced the upheavals of the war era and who in many cases had been directly involved in the armed forces and military combat. So basically saying, Victorian era England, like basically the Queen's English and concepts from the 1800s started to die out during this turn of the century when people went into war. The Europeans started fighting each other. Black people were sent overseas to fight Europeans, to fight each other, Caribbean versus continental. It was a lot of all that prestige that the European queendom, Victorian era concepts that started to die out, because you start to see a savage fighting and a manhood and things being tested. So it started to die out. It's what they're saying, that Queen's era English and concepts of class and who's higher up based on these European concepts, basically. In the immediate post-World War I period, economic dislocations combined with black migration to cities and the return of black and white war veterans create an atmosphere of acute tension. Mobs of whites attacked and massacred African Americans or American Africans in several cities in 1919, including in Chicago and Washington, D.C. American Africans fought back against those attacks with self-defense efforts, sometimes being led or influenced by black military veterans. So Washington, D.C., the capital of the USA government, and Chicago, where it had a large Caribbean Islander influence, recent Caribbean Islander influence. They had massacres, and they said the black people fought back. Example, sometimes led by black military combat veterans. So these were coordinated, basically military formations that popped up. Military formations popped up. When it's wild. It's like that movie, The Spook Sat by the Door. But yeah, that's a significant paragraph. So black militaries popped up basically to fight back, coordinated by military veterans. That's interesting. Well, that's interesting. Wow, the military combat. Okay, examples of political tensions, confrontations, and violence add further depth to such discussions about the militarization of society in World War I era in the 1920s, including the use of self-defense strategies by Afro-descendants and the concurrent trend towards militarism in some organizations. So I gotta pause again because this is just showing you, one of the reasons Black Africa doesn't see a lot of USA, boots on the ground fighting is because of this paragraph right here. Black people from the American Africans take the opportunity to mobilize armies when they have when they have contact with other black people and they have military experience. It's showing you right there that black people from America will mobilize their own militaries. You drop them in Africa in a mass number, someone's gonna get the idea to, hey, I'm gonna organize these black people here militarily. I'm gonna integrate. I'm gonna form a sort of like Narmer and King Menace of Egypt. They're going to form new militaries and new civilizations. That was what was happening in the era Garvey came and the war veterans came back. They started saying we need to organize people militarily with our military experience. So that's still a reality where you don't see a lot of certain things that you think would happen, like invading Africa directly for the USA. It hasn't happened because of a high black military presence and the fact that they could, give us a free ride to Africa. We're going to change things up. Or if you try to race massacre in the black neighborhoods, we're going to use our military experience to defend ourselves. So that's a reality. Now I wanted to note, all right, now the rise of what might be called or might be termed paramilitarism, acting in a way which is similar to military force, but without the legitimacy of state recognition in black community in the World War I era rose largely out of necessity given state of domestic race relations in USA, but also partly from developments on the international stage. These developments include the war itself, the Russian Revolution, the impact of Irish republicanism. The most notable instances of organizational black paramilitarism was the African Blood Brotherhood, the the ABB, fused black nationalism with socialism and was on the fringes of the American Communist movement. It was formed maybe in 1919 by a set of left-wing intellectuals. I'm going to skip their names because so it was a group with heavy Caribbean influence. It is worth noting that Cyril Briggs claimed that immigrants from the Caribbean also formed the majority of the ABB's grassroots New York membership. Another link between black nationalism in New York and the perception that it was dominated by Caribbean blacks. So I'm just trying to summarize this to make this thing run faster. Otherwise, I'll be here for hours. I want to speed through this. So we're on page 6 now. Okay, the Brotherhood probably had the African blood. That's a tongue twister. African Blood Brotherhood probably had somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 members, mainly in New York. Its magazine, The Crusader, preached black pride and with an emphasis on self-defense. Many members, including Briggs, were inspired by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, its 1916 Eastern Rebellion, 1916 Easter Rebellion against British rule. The ABB's most notorious publicity came during the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, during which a white mafia mob virtually destroyed the black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The ABB found itself accused of fomenting the violence. It's possible that the combativeness of the ABB, often expressed through the writings in Briggs Crusader magazine, helped to fuel the militancy of the UNIA, while the UNIA's influence gave credibility to the ABB's nationalist platform. Winston James has argued that one of the reasons for the decline of ABB was that the Brotherhood shared its members with the UNIA, and whenever ABB leaders criticized the UNIA, many ABB members left the group or left the organization, man. It's funny. Okay, groups like the ABB and UNIA symbolize a particular vision for black masculinity, allowing black military veterans and others in the community the opportunity to prove their ability to protect the communities against attack. That's very important. According to Robert Hill, it was the Irish revolutionary cause, and specifically the example of 1916 Easter Week Rising that impacted most powerfully on Garvey's personal brand of radical politics in the war area. So that's interesting, saying the Irish versus the British. Maybe that showed that, the British monarchy was not all powerful. They had fractions in the white world, and it encouraged them to start striking back when there was a divide and conquer type thing Garvey had going on. So Garvey built a support base for UNIA in the post-war period, the post-World War I period, by utilizing rhetoric, focused heavily on resistance, and constantly appealed to black military veterans, many who were angry about violence and injustice that continued after they came back to their homeland, the USA. Yep. So Garvey built on the war and the racial conflict that continued with the military veterans, seeing that their service was not appreciated and that the race problem wasn't solved by them going to fight and die overseas. So Garvey exploited that, the military, black U.S. military, he recruited them. Okay, so the appeals also found significant report among the wider black community who were not necessarily military veterans. The context of surging anti-colonial fundamentalism is a crucial part of understanding UNIA's appeal immediately after the war, with strikes erupting in South Africa, the Caribbean island, as well as protests and arrests in China, Turkey, India, Palestine, named but a few locations. The Crusader and the Messenger hailed these developments in anti-colonial and anti-Western struggles. The early UNIA was part of this, environment, with Garvey in particular using such rhetoric to inspire black people who were pissed off in the United States, basically. The UNIA's initial growth in the immediate post-war, post-European World War era years occurred primarily in the northern and midwestern urban areas, NYC, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia. They had experienced severe recent anti-black violence. So this sentence says New York City and Southern Florida have a large number of Caribbean immigrants. Florida and New York, basically, New York City, very Caribbean. So in the urban north, early and very successful UNIA outposts, military outposts, were established in some cities of the coastal south. So it's including Norfolk, Virginia as the coastal south. That's interesting. The DMV, part of the south. to Virginia. That's very interesting. That's a DMV is a key place for us today. Headquartered DMV, Florida, the old Spanish Florida. We're still using that map that covers the Louisiana Purchase and Alabama, West Florida. So we're using that. So this is a very interesting article. So it's just noting Virginia, Florida, New Orleans, these coastal southern areas had UNIA expansion. There are over 400 local divisions in the South. Nearly half of the whole United States total was located in the South. So it was pretty even north and south, I guess. Maybe West Coast had some branches, but the South had half of the total. Despite and perhaps because of the UNIA's early success that was rapid, there was hostility from the ranks of America's black leadership in the decade after World War I. In August 1922, pro-UNIA clergyman Junius Austin despairingly told an audience of UNIA supporters that all the lines that the white man had drawn from Maine to Texas are not as injurious to the black race as the lines we have drawn right here in our own crowd. The UNIA's unpopularity with other black leaders developed for a variety of reasons, but the leaders of other black organizations in the U.S. almost certainly resented the wide grassroots popularity of Garvey's organization. Also significant, however, was the fact that Garvey stridently rejected coalitions with more integrationist organizations like the NAACP and black left-wing, communist groups. Yup. The integrationist organizations. I consider the black communists this integrationist, so it's the same. So he rejected basically he had a black, just like the Native Americans had their tribal government. That's what the UNIA was kind of structured like. Blood rules and those kind of things. Intermarriage laws are in the Constitution. So it's basically a tribal, black blood tribal government, similar to Native Americans, but just improperly structured and improperly named. But it's basically a tribal government, the UNIA, structurally and from the Constitution. Let's see. Yes, tribal government. So in September 1919, a Bureau of Investigation assistant director noted in an official report that Garvey had created well-drilled military organization for the purpose of protection and to prevent anyone from disturbing the meetings which he addresses. This organization was the African Legion, a self-defense auxiliary units of which were often attached to local UNIA divisions in both the North and the South, particularly in urban areas. The creation of the African Legion was but the most prominent indication of the UNIA's commitment to self-defense, sometimes as a symbolic act, but sometimes also as a direct physical one. This study will argue that the African Legion is an important factor to explaining why the UNIA became involved in political violence, because militarism was therefore given a physical expression that was embedded in the organization structure. Although this does not necessarily mean that incidents of violence were always the UNIA's fault as such, members of the African Legion paraded, drilled, and wore uniforms modeled on those of the U.S. Army. In some cases, members of the Legion possessed and used firearms, although it is difficult to be sure of exactly how widespread firearms ownership was among UNIA members. In the summer of 1922, some members of the New Orleans UNIA division were reported to have brandished guns at New Orleans Police Department officers who were trying to disrupt a speech that Garvey was delivering in the city. The most dramatic incident involving the UNIA and firearms occurred in August 1927 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when police units attempted to gain entry to a meeting of the local UNIA division. The encounter quickly became confrontational, and although it is unclear which side fired first, UNIA African Legion guards exchanged gunfire with police officers, leaving 3 men seriously wounded. The line between respectable violence for example, as deployed to protect self and family against attack by whites and unrespectable violence such as political brawls, was, however, clearly a fine one. Martin Summers has argued that, in general, the UNIA's vision of community activism relied on a fundamentally conservative Victorian vision of respectable class-based manhood. In the interior of the South, the African Legion was focused on military-style organization and symbolism represented the respectable masculine aims of protecting family and the community from white predators. As Summers points out, however, many UNIA divisions undoubtedly had primarily working class memberships. Let's see. Okay. As Summers points out, however, many UNIA divisions undoubtedly had primarily working class memberships, with many may have seemed in the eyes of middle class blacks to be unrespectable values. While the respectability norms of the integrationist NAACP were thoroughly middle class, those of the UNIA blended middle class respectability with concerns about community solidarity, self-esteem, and group survival. Respectability within UNIA then had greater flexibility as more scope for tension when set against traditional Victorian tropes. So basically, it's talking. There's a mix of Victorian England, middle class versus America, Southern, or let me say, a working class America, and the British Victorian era values. All a mix. They're unified by a sense of survival to a certain degree. Now, respectability within UNIA had gender as well as class delineations. When it came to protecting black women from white male predators, UNIA's approach to self-defense through the African Legion represented a form of gender hierarchy within which women were generally assumed to both require and be grateful for male protection. Scholars have pointed to the fact that this racial nationalism meant that while women were undoubtedly valued members of the organization, they were expected to conform to gender norms and hierarchies, which generally kept them less powerful than UNIA men and were often cast in the traditional roles of mothers, wives, caregivers first and foremost. However, it has also been persuasively argued that Garveyite women used the organization as a powerful vehicle to openly express their discontent with a range of forms of oppression, including gender, race, and class. Okay. Now that paragraph, there was also a women's motors corps. There was like women were given their own or were created their own military within the UNIA. So there was a women military too. So that's an interesting paragraph to say the least. There was a women's military too. So, but yeah, they say, there's some criticism there. But anyways, the African Legion can be seen as standing at the crossroads of the UNIA's vision of respectability, because in the interior of the South, it generally fulfilled the role of respectable community protection against white attack, or at least preparing for such protection. However, in urban areas where members of the Legion became involved in political violence against black rivals, these particular members veered away from class-based respectability norms and into a murkier, less reputable world brought about by the intense urban rivalries of post-World War I activism. The African Legion sometimes became involved in violence against the UNIA's external enemies, both black and white, and it was against its rivals in the black community that the UNIA often directed its strongest attacks. At the 1922 UNIA convention in New York City, Thomas Anderson, UNIA commissioner for Louisiana, told his audience that those black people who have anxious, faltering faith in Garvey and the UNIA should have their throats cut, and they ought to be sent to hell where they belong. His statement was met by applause from the gathered UNIA faithful. Garvey frequently made similar statements of blacks who were not aligned with the UNIA. Woo, yeah. Woo. Louisiana, we know about them hot boys. Okay. Okay, Louisiana, okay. Garvey, writing in 1924, Garvey said, "The vicious and wicked of our race have tried to handicap us at every turn. These men we will have to dislodge from leadership. We have to take them out of the pulpits, off the platforms, and from the public places and relegate them to the scrap heap of racial treachery because of the the advantages of the education that some of them have had. They tried to use it to stultify the growth of the common people, but the common people shall make them bow down on their knees and beg for bread." Hey, this is it's some African stuff, man. So, yeah, so they're talking about pulpits, pastors, educated men being saboteurs. Okay, this kind of rhetoric was a veiled swipe at the NAACP, which was perceived by many in UNIA circles as being too bourgeois. At one annual UNIA convention in Harlem, several reps from local divisions of across U.S. spoke out against African Americans who did not lend their support to the organization. A delegate from Blytheville, Arkansas, highlighted the issues of class tension, saying the Negro of wealth in the South stood between the masses and their salvation. Let's see. Let me see. This is page 8. Alleged instances of UNIA involvement in violence against other black people soon made their way into the press. In October 1922, the Chicago Whip newspaper reported that William Ware, president of the Cincinnati UNIA division, had been found guilty, along with 3 other men, of assaulting Samuel Saxon, a black lecturer from New York. Ware was said to have struck at him, Saxon, with a knife while Saxon was speaking against Garvey at a local meeting. June 1923, with Garvey standing trial on federal mail fraud charges, the Chicago Defender reported that Charles Lennon, a subway porter and member of Garvey's African Legion, was sentenced to 2 months in jail, where he had stood in the courtroom and declared he'd kill anybody to spoke a word against Garvey. While the attack against Saxon may have been an isolated incident, the case of Lennon is one example of the different roles that the African Legion could play depending on setting and circumstance. In more urban settings with national level leaders present, the Legion sometimes became involved in intimidation and violence against black and white enemies for political purposes, whereas in more rural areas of the South, it generally undertook preparations for community self-defense against attack by white supremacists. So basically it says in the North, things were going buck wild, and in the South, things were more orderly as far as self-defense. More orderly in the South. Isn't that something? Okay. Okay. So by it's all about the land. Rural areas of the South. It was, wow. That's interesting. All right. By 1923, some sections of the black press were not only reporting UNIA involvement in political violence against other blacks, but were making a general point about organizations' alleged capacity for fomenting confrontations. The Norfolk Journal and Guide, for example, commented, "It is interesting to note that an increasing number of race newspapers are putting their condemnation upon the bullying, threatening tactics of the UNIA. Reports such as this were often circulated by Garvey's opponents in the press that they were undoubtedly designed to add to the unfavorable perception that the UNIA tended towards the use of violence against its rivals." The Chicago Defender, edited by Robert Abbott, competed for readers with the UNIA's Negro World. Among a similar constituency, and Abbott and Garvey eventually took to attacking each other in print. National white newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post also had reason to dislike Garvey, given his outspoken criticisms of white violence and his calls for blacks to organize to resist oppression. Given the level of white prejudice against black activism, it is unsurprising that white newspapers seized upon prominent examples of a black organization like the UNIA behaving lawlessly and used them as a way to cast such activism as disreputable and futile, as well as tensions between Garveyites and black people who did not support the UNIA. Fault lines also became apparent within the UNIA itself. The UNIA's general worldview meant that at times, particularly when personal rivalries emerged between different leaders within the UNIA, those leaders or liable to target and blame other ethnic groups within the organization itself. UNIA politics contained a heavy nativist streak that could vary between race-based unity on the one hand and the intra-racial, ethnic, and national nativism on the other. This tendency derived from the organization's general philosophical outlook, which saw different racial groups struggling to survive and to dominate. The issue of ethnic nativism within UNIA played a part in what is perhaps the most notorious murder of a black person allegedly carried out by UNIA on New Year's Day, 1923. Reverend James Eason, I think of the AME or AME Zion Church, who had been one of Garvey's most charismatic and successful lieutenants, was shot dead in New Orleans, Louisiana. An African American from North Carolina, Eason was viewed by some in the UNIA as being even more talented orator than Garvey himself. His official UNIA title, basically the president or leader of American Negroes. That's a constitutional title. It's in the Constitution that there should be one, or in the original Constitution. So his title indicates his popularity amongst the Garveyite rank and file in the USA, and the general awareness that Garvey himself was inherently linked with a Caribbean background. Now that's in the Constitution. President of Africa, President of American Negroes, President of West Indies, South and Central America. Three different presidents. Three different presidents of general assemblies, presiding officers, gathering people. It was like three separate town halls. So it's interesting. Minimum. So okay. So Eason's murder came in the wake of a very public falling out, as Garvey had become increasingly suspicious of his popularity and influence within the organization. In the USA, Eason, in response, spoke out against people of Caribbean descent within the American UNI in the hope that this would turn African American Garveyites against their leader. Garvey had Eason formally expelled from the UNIA in August 1922, but Eason responded by setting up an anti-Garvey organization with similar aims to those of the UNIA itself. At the start of Garvey's mail fraud trial, Eason liaised with what would become the FBI about the possibility of standing as a witness against his former boss. He also contacted the NAACP field secretary, Walter White, who was involved in the federal U.S. government's investigation into Garvey's activities, and reportedly told White that he wanted to destroy Garvey and the UNIA. Woo! Just before Eason's murder, Garvey had directed Esau Ramus, an African Legion leader originally from the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, to go to New Orleans from Philly, where Remus had been organizing African Legion units. While in Philly, Remus had been arrested for possession of a firearm and for inciting a riot at a meeting led by Eason. There has been much speculation about whether or not the subsequent murder of Eason was directly ordered by Garvey himself, and ultimately the evidence is inconclusive. However, Ramus eventually identified as one of the attackers who shot Eason in New Orleans, along with William Shakespeare, what a name, and the Jamaican Fred Dyer, two New Orleans UNIA supporters. Whether or not Garvey personally ordered Eason's hit, ethnic tensions had come to the foreground in the dispute between the two men, even though ethnicity wasn't the original cause of the quarrel. Those tensions bubbled over. Eason versus Garvey confrontation speaks to the fact issues of ethnicity had the potential to explode pre-existing conflicts over power and influence. At the same time, a bitter feud was developing between Garvey and the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois, a vendetta which was variously expressed in ethnic and class terms. NAACP leaders and UNIA leaders differed from each other in several ways in the 1920s, most fundamentally on the issues of separation versus integration. Basically, the UNIACL was a tribal government, and as I said, it's more you got to connect with the tribes in Africa. They didn't do that successfully, and so the NAACP. So they argued over ways to improve Black people's situation. One issue was how the most contentious issue One of them was response to white violence against the black people. NAACP recommended gather evidence of lynchings and put pressure on the government authorities to act against mobs. Garvey, on the other hand, dismissed that, instead advocating self-defense, the paramilitary, and in short term and long term, traveling to Africa basically for a base and backup. In September 1921, now in today's day, we could travel to damn Caribbean to set it up. Yeah, Jamaica and Haiti, we could set it up in Jamaica and Haiti, Royal African Society. So that's got to be done. In September 1921, Garvey gave a speech to UNIA supporters in which he presented white violence not only as one of the most pressing problems facing African Americans, but also one that clearly illustrated fundamental differences between the programs of the UNIA and the NAACP. Here you have two leaders in two extremes, one in power who is clinging to his racial identity, and the other, Du Bois, who has no power and who is giving away, subordinating and destroying his racial identity, the greatest weapon the Negro has for his development. Du Bois' program means that Dr. Du Bois tells us to remain here until we get killed, remain here until we are killed, are ready to be killed, because according to the attitude of those white men who represent the KKK, America now is and always will be a white man's country. It's only a question of time. Yeah. Okay, Garvey's personal rhetoric directly added to the sense of irreconcilable difference between the programs of UNIA and NAACP, both at the time and subsequently. After the summer of 1921, Garvey increased his attack on black American leaders, who he perceived to be compromised by their links to white society, as he distanced himself from integrationism in an attempt to persuade the U.S. government that he was not a security threat. So that's funny, because in today, so to show that he wasn't a security threat, he shied away from integration. That's interesting, because we all know that's crazy. That's wild. Nowadays, it's the opposite. She tried to create, well, it's ways to do everything. That's just interesting. There's 5 more pages. I'm going to try and cut this right here. Yeah. I'll cut this right